Hi, everyone. My name is Devon Tietjen, and I am the co-host of Generation M.A.D. And today I'll be introducing this friendly takeover of Sustain What, Andy Revkin's Earth Institute podcast, where he interviews with specialists, students like us, and other people from around the world and differing backgrounds. Now, today, myself, Devon, and my co-host Sofia Assab, and my other co-host, me, Winther-Tamaki, have been graciously awarded the opportunity to talk to Vijay Vaitheeswaran, and he is a global climate expert. There he is, who is also the host of to a lesser degree, a limited podcast through The Economist, which has ended, but you can still catch him on other podcasts like Babbage, The Economist Science and Technology podcast, and The Intelligence, where he is a contributor. Now, Vijay currently is the Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor at The Economist, where he has done immense work over his career covering the developing world, climate in the current economies of the US, Europe, Asia, and more, and has contributed immensely, especially during his podcast work on COP26, where I think that's where some of the best coverage for me was, I have to say, especially when it came to synthesizing everything that was happening, since there was so much going on and making it in a format where it could be easily consumed. So I'd like to say thank you, Vijay, for coming on. And yeah.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Only a mother could love. So you're too kind. But it's great to be with you and look forward to our robust discussion and debate today.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So, as at Generation Mad, we like to start off with just a beginning question because I don't know if everyone who tunes in knows this, but our name stands for making a difference or mutually assured destruction. So it's kind of, and I think in your podcast work and your journalistic work, there's this constant question of like which direction are we going, and it's always really interesting to begin with the question of like where do you stand? Are you, I think in our generation there's a lot of hopelessness, and then sometimes we see just people who power through and see that we're going to be this great making a difference generation. But it's always interesting to start with that, like where do you think we are in this climate crisis?
Yeah.
So it depends on which side of the bed I get out of in the morning. On some days, I share the prevailing kind of gloom that it's too late, that the the warming is already likely to reach thresholds within our lifetimes that are going to make parts of the world, maybe even significant parts of humanity's world, unbearable. And I think there is a real prospect of that if we continue business as usual, the way things have been happening. But I have to say, I get up on the other side of the bed more often, and what I feel is that this is a 100-year plus problem. If we think about how long-lived carbon dioxide is, it stays in the atmosphere more than a century, and it's a kind of problem that we're not used to dealing with as human societies, right? It's a intergenerational problem. It's a international problem, and the kind of ethics, the kind of morality, the kind of sacrifice, the kind of investments we need to make, we don't have a lot of precedent in human history to do, and so this is going to be with us for a very long time, and Earth systems are resilient. The Earth will survive. It's a question of whether we will survive, we and our children and grandchildren, in a way of life that is reasonable, that is comfortable, reasonable, with a prospect for future generations to live as well or better in future. And in that, I think if you acknowledge that there's some resilience and some give and take, I tend to take some inspiration from the great environmental thinker and pragmatist Stuart Brand, who published the Whole Earth Catalog more than 5 decades ago, a seminal work which first published the view of the entire Earth from space, that blue dot that we're all very familiar with now, that inspires astronauts and poets. Well, that practical guide to how to live in a way that's more respectful of the Earth, that's worth going up and looking at and reading, if for those listeners who haven't. He said, we are as gods, and we might as well get good at it. And so rather than feel helpless, let's acknowledge that we live in an age in which the main global warming cause is humanity and our actions. The Anthropocene age, as we call it these days, our actions are by far the most impactful of any species. Many of them are deleterious, but a lot of them are reversible, or certainly we have the capacity within human ingenuity, within the choices we make with our investments, the way we organize our cities, our built infrastructure, our energy systems, our agricultural systems, to change. And so let's start that process now. And there are already wheels in motion on all of these things. Let's accelerate it and do it with more ambition. So that's where I tend to end up.
And an important thing about that, because you were talking about like the quote of "We are gods" in a way, that kind of takes a holistic approach to the universe in a sense, like one entity, one thing that is causing and driving action. Where the plural of that, gods, makes us these individual people, these individual entities that have extremely impactful or just a lot of power. Like we have a lot of impact. We have the ability to change a lot of things. But then when you break that up between a lot of people, that's when you start needing communication. And that goes into what you do, which is you synthesize a lot of what's going on in the world and you make it so people who aren't experts, who aren't in the room of, for example, COP or these other really big discussions or even small discussions where, like you began a lot of your podcasts, you gave these little anecdotes of experiences you had with either BP climate execs or going out to Hawaii or all these other times where it was just really interesting and insightful to see these little moments that you kind of pulled out. But in your own work, and I guess this could also be like, how did you get your position speaking about the climate and how did you develop your role as the editor on climate? But also, how do you find your work on synthesizing such an important topic into articles, into something that could be consumed and that itself has impact and influence on the rest of those little gods running around the world? Like, how have you found that experience has been, and how have you developed that?
So it's a real privilege to have the opportunity as a foreign correspondent, which is really my career as a journalist, but in particular one who has had the opportunity to travel and to report from all over the world and to live in China. I lived a number of years in China, in Mexico City, and of course in Europe, in the United States, and have traveled to many parts of the world in my job. And to have an entree to go and, so let's say, challenge the Saudi oil minister on how exactly their particular policies are and their alliance with the United States, to find out that, in fact, the alliance with the United States, which, to remind our listeners, between the most important oil producing country in the world, right? Saudi Arabia has the world's largest reserves of oil. It has the cheapest reserves of oil. It has the largest unexploited reserves of oil. And importantly for the climate discussion, which people haven't focused on yet, it also has just about the lowest carbon dioxide intensive production of oil, which kind of blows your mind when you think about it. It's actually, if oil could be green, which it cannot, I would put to you, if we burn it in a vehicle, because it always emits greenhouse gases, making the oil in Saudi Arabia, lifting it out of the ground, is so simple that it's it's the least carbon intensive way of doing it. Unlike, for example, the tar sands in Canada or the heavy oils in Venezuela or even lots of other offshore places. And so you have this odd conundrum, so that they're probably going to be the place that sells the last barrel of oil to the world some decades from now, whenever that day is. And it'll be the Saudis, and they'll still be making a profit on it, is my prediction. But part of how they've been able to continue is because after World War II, there was a famous summit in which several of the world's leaders who were victorious, it was FDR from the United States, of course, it was Churchill, and it was Stalin. They met at a summit of Yalta, pretty well known to history buffs. But less well known is after that summit, FDR met on a U.S. Naval ship with an obscure figure, a man named Saud, who was the tribal chief of an emerging country at that time, Saudi Arabia. And his reports, the American energy companies told him there's oil in this province that could be developed. And so FDR struck a deal, a secret deal, where the United States would provide security protection for the royal family, not for the people or the country, but for the royal family, in return for the right of American companies to exploit that oil and bring it to world market. That deal, which was not very well advertised at the time, was probably changed the course of geopolitics, of climate, of the direction of the world economy more than any other secret deal. And so I asked the Saudi oil minister, this was after 9/11, after the backlash, what do you think about that American deal? And he said, I'm not so sure that deal is in place anymore. We can't count on the United States. And that was suddenly when they began to do a pivot towards selling to China, towards entirely new markets. And so that conversation, which is not a public comment at that time, but I was able to come and ask him that question and challenge him. I think that's part of what I take away from this, both as a privilege of my job, but what each one of us can do is to be a critical thinker. I think that's really what we need at this time. There are too many bandwagons, too many shibboleths, and we need to challenge them, including our own preconceptions on how to tackle climate change, or how evil is big oil. There are a lot of things that people say, but when you actually spend time and think about it, talk to the people involved, understand their incentives, their motivations, you can get a better idea, a smarter idea about how to solve the problem. And that's really what I tend to be focused on. Is we have a really big problem, an existential problem. How do we get the most resources towards solving that problem? And that's the sort of conversation I try to encourage on my podcast, as well as in the writings that I do for The Economist.
Yeah, I think one thing that I definitely got from your podcast, and also just that response, is the power of being in the room and what that does to our critical thinking. Like, there's just something about, and I think what your podcast does so beautifully, to a lesser degree, is brings people into that room and lets people hear the voices of the people you're conversing with. And I just had this really interesting experience this past semester at Columbia, where I found myself in the room. I was working, it's my senior year. I did a capstone project with Columbia Dining, where we acted as, myself along with 12 other students, or 10 other students, acted as consultants for Columbia Dining. We were trying to get access to certain numbers and how, like, to a true scope 30 analysis, and being in that room and kind of getting that, we weren't being presented Columbia Dining by Columbia Dining itself. We weren't seeing these posters all over with, oh, we're a sustainable dining operation. We were actually getting to truly understand what was going on, and also how the dining operate. This is such a small little kind of case study, but it was, dining wanted to see individual change, and we wanted to see big action change from dining. For example, they wanted students to rally up and say, we don't want to drink bottled water. But we wanted dining to say, nope, we're not going to sell bottled water here anymore. We have a bunch of fountains. It's just not going to happen. And there was this really interesting kind of push and pull between the two entities. And in the past, I've really been someone who has championed individual action, and that's something that came up a lot on, to a lesser degree, like, what can we do ourselves? I spent a year after high school traveling throughout Southeast Asia and kind of just living in really small communities and seeing how those communities dealt with waste actually up front, rather than in the United States where everything's kind of packed up and sent away. It made me go zero waste, and I had a lot of people say to me, oh, that's just one person, what are you doing? But back to my original point, like, when I was in this room with an institution that could make a big change, I ended up feeling a lot of frustration. Like, come on, like, just do it. And I just think it's such an interesting discussion point. Like, where, like, is there a place that we meet in the middle? Is it something where we're in a COVID crisis situation where we need real action to happen and not wait for the people to pick up? Like, that's one of the things that I've just been grappling with as a young person coming into this space of sustainable development. Where do I push? And I'm sure you have some thoughts on that, because I heard a lot to a lesser degree.
Yeah, that dining saga puts a sort of a crystal clear I think, spotlight on a couple of the issues. One is the role of personal action, which may be in tension with or which could propel, let's say, systemic forces or the institutions that kind of make choices for us. And the other is really a deeper question, and that I want to actually turn it around on you in a moment, and that is, what is your theory of change? How do you think revolution happens? How do you think big change happens? And I'd like to hear from each of you. But just on the point about individual action, I think it's really important that each of us think about how important particular issues are. And I remember, though I'm thinking about climate all the time, it's not the only thing I think about. And as we're in the midst of this pandemic, all of us think to varying degrees about, hey, how do we keep the loved ones in our life safe, for example? Even if you're young and healthy and vaccinated and can take risks, maybe you're seeing grandma for Christmas or something, or the holidays. So it's really forced us to think about trade-offs, to think about risk versus risk. And I think that's a really healthy place to be, because normally, in my experience, people who are obsessed with one topic, or however important it seems to be or actually may be, tend to think less critically about the topic and think about absolutes. And absolutism, I think, in my and history suggests, leads to bad outcomes, and because it doesn't bring everyone on board. And in terms of individual choices, not everyone is going to be marching on the streets, and not everyone is going to behave and change their lives in the most radical and uncomfortable ways. So how do we change society and our behavior and our energy consumption and our greenhouse gas patterns in a way that brings along 100% of the people, or at least almost 100%? Because if you only have the most motivated and green 5 or 10%, the ones that are willing to make completely radical changes or live in a cave without any modern sort of accoutrement, then we're not going to solve this problem, right? How do you get 90% plus? And the answer has to be through things like the built environment, for example. For most of us, there's not that much we can do to affect our de facto contributions to climate change, because the choices have been made by, in your case, the university housing and the buildings and the HVAC systems that are there, and whether they are going to upgrade to heat pumps or remain on sets, let's say district heating, or are they going to use coal-fired versus, how quickly they might move to some form of zero carbon energies. These are all choices I think almost no one on most campuses has much input on. You can agitate, you can protest, but generally the choices are made by facilities managers. At some level, it's made by a finance committee that weighs up the price options, maybe some negotiations with the utility. And so, and normally people are not involved in that conversation who are not part of the administration, right? We can expand it to the level of choices made by the built environment, by our governments. We just passed a very big and impressive infrastructure law in Congress. There's another bill that's waiting that may or may not pass, called Build Back Better, that has a lot more climate provisions. But that infrastructure law, by and large, has money to pave roads and fix bridges and pour more concrete. And that's good. We have decrepit infrastructure. Nobody wants bridges falling apart in the Bronx, right? So that's great. But we all know what history shows and economics shows, if you build more roads, what happens? You get more traffic. It's not a climate bill. It's not an environment bill. It's an infrastructure bill, which may very well fix these roads and expand them. In Texas, they want to build a bunch of new highways using this money from Washington. And so for the next 30, 40, 50 years, those highways will be there, ferrying probably diesel and internal combustion engine vehicles, absent some form of intervention that encourages electrification of those vehicles, greening of the grid, maybe long-term, some form of green hydrogen for long-distance transport. Unless we promote various alternatives, it's going to be the de facto. And so that's why I say we need systems change, especially on this topic, because most of the choices we make, save getting on a plane and flying to Tokyo or eating steak for lunch and dinner every day, absent those choices, which are very greenhouse gas intensive, most of the things we do are on the margin compared to the choices that have been made on our behalf by people we didn't elect, even in the case of building administrators. But now to you guys, what do you think brings about change, ambitious change?
Well, I know for me first, what I've kind of seen, and I study architecture as a background. So like when it comes to development and all these projects, a lot of the conversation I've been privy to has been, how do we reduce the climate impact of something that's going to happen anyway, which is building, right? Using new materials. So in that conversation, a lot of it is micro changes on individual products over a whole supply chain that then ends up producing a larger portion of greenhouse gases out of a projected rise in production or use. But when it comes to the actual changes themselves, I guess it really depends on the kind of institution that you have, whether it's like a democratic institution, whether it's a monopoly of a few individuals who are making all the decisions, or if it's like an autocratic system of just one individual. Because then in a democratic system, you see that you are able to have some kind of protest movement or groundswell of individual support that ends up getting enough notoriety that you can have a larger impact, or the people who are in charge notice. And that's because they do get elected, or some of the people making decisions do get elected, and then they might talk to the ones who don't. Where when you have systems that are a little more cloistered from individuals, they tend to be even more conservative because it's about their own comfort and their own place. And I think it really ends up coming down to, for me at least, what I've seen is how effective the public outcry is and how able the public is to affect the position of those people who do make the decisions. Where if you're, for example, a tenured professor at an institution, you might not have as much of an interest in those changes versus if you're a new professor in a climate school who's like trying to, make a place for themselves. You then might support students in a way that the other professor wouldn't. And then in the real world, there's others examples of that as well. Like, for example, Greta Thunberg, who is like the most vocal person, I think, on climate and has been for a while for someone of our generation, the Gen Z. She's like extremely young in comparison to all the other people who we're looking towards. I mean, I know for us in the US, Bernie Sanders is like the next, closest person, and that's a huge age difference. That's multiple generations. So it's really interesting to see exactly that, like how it's based on different individuals, different environments. I mean, the decisions and the responsibility of someone in the US is different than the responsibility of someone in the developing world as well, even an American to a European. That's another thing. Like, the context of your environment has a big impact on the decisions you have to make, where we saw that during COVID, where in COVID, like, our environmental footprint dropped because we weren't using as many things, but the largest portion of that came from the US. Like, there was clear data on our impact on the environment because of how little we really did during that like whole year of us being in lockdown. And it really shows like how not everyone's decision is equal. There isn't an equity in your choices. It really comes down to how much you do consume at the end of the day. So it's in me, it's like it's a little more specific to what is your place, like what is the context of your environment, and then based on that, the decision making and the movements can be different.
Yeah. Oh, this conversation kind of brings me back to why I started studying sustainability and climate in general, because I thought I was going to go into human rights or creative writing before I took this specific class in my senior year of high school. I went to this really amazing high school where they offered really great classes. This was called Global Futures, Global Warming. And I remember seeing this graph that I talk about this all the time, so he's heard this before, but they showed this graph where in the United States, we are like consuming this much. And then in the Congo, they're consuming this much. And I was just like, that's just, and everyone has heard this if they are in the world of climate crisis. And that's like that. If you are in the United States, you're probably consuming 5 Earths worth of stuff versus what some people are getting. And I just saw this and I was like, that's insane. And I don't know if it's because I have family in Morocco where at the time the consumption was much lower, and I saw the life there at a very young age and how drastically different it was from my life in the United States. And just hearing about my dad's childhood living in the Atlas Mountains and having a wooden block as a toy versus when I was little, I had a plastic Elmo that talked and 5 baby dolls that were all plastic. And just I think what Devon is saying, where it totally depends, like, how do we make change? It really kind of, I agree, you have to kind of focus in, like, okay, where are we making that change? And because I'm in the United States, I generally focus on how do we bring this like this. Like, we can't just continue to have people living at such a low standard of living when I can walk into the streets of New York and go get access to basically anything I want. We need to have a much more equity in access, but what that takes is people who are currently consuming so much and have this certain standard of living have to give that up. And what I'm so interested in my studies is, what do we do to make people willing to give up their current standard of life? And I think the way that we make change, especially in a system like the United States, where there is so much emphasis on the individual and individual choice. For example, we were just talking about how in New York they tried to ban large sodas.
The 2-liter ones, yeah.
Yeah, 2-liter sodas for health reasons. And even though New York is so seen as a pretty progressive place, there was a huge backlash on this choice, because it people said, you can't tell me what soda I'm going to go buy. I'm going to go buy the largest soda now, even though I never bought it before. Like, there's this just reaction in the US of, do not take away my autonomy. And I would say that the way that we make change is, I totally agree, it can't be this 5% of people who get everything, understand the problems, understand the holes and kind of general arguments. But we need to make people kind of see the fact that they live in a community a lot more. Like, my actions impact you, impact Devon.
And a global community, too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that's happening with this, like, with the fact that we're in this insane moment of globalization where we can tune into COP26 and see what global leaders are saying in a way that I think has really never happened before. But there has to be this stronger emphasis on, if I'm succeeding, great. But if you're succeeding too, that's what's even better. Like, and in the end, I'm not really a successful person if there's someone on this globe that we share who is suffering because of my consumption levels. And I think that's the way that we really drive change, is like tap into that good part of humanity, which is empathy, where you see, like, I wouldn't want this for myself. So why are my actions making this happen? Like, and kind of combine those two things. And I think I do see that happening more and more, especially in our circles of like younger people.
Well, I think that the point about the stark differences in levels of consumption, harkening back to your youth in Morocco, I was born and grew up partly in India before moving to the US. So I saw it as well. Every summer we'd go back and spend with my grandparents, and the material comforts, but also just generally the opportunities that were available to my cousins versus to me in America was a world apart, right? And the big change in one generation has been, unlike in almost all of human history, where just a handful of countries, mostly in Western Europe and North America, were able to prosper through the Industrial Revolution and multiple things that go with it, right? We can talk about extraction of resources, a legacy of colonialism, but there was a major leapfrog powered in part by the Industrial Revolution and resource-intensive manner of growth. In the last 30 years, we've seen the East Asian miracle, where a small number of countries, Taiwan, Singapore, of course, we could look at Southeast Asia, and ultimately China, have been able to provide much greater prosperity for their countries, develop real middle classes, integrate with the world economy. But there has been a massive consumption impact, right? And so this is the tension, I think, right at the heart of the climate challenge. And that is, it really goes back to a much deeper conversation about sustainable development. And that has been discussed for decades in expert commissions and United Nations panels that predated the current COP26 or the COP process. The UN Summit on Sustainable Development really tried to grapple with the challenge of poverty alleviation and economic growth that most of the world still sees as their main imperative. Much of the world does not live in comfort and sort of, middle class or greater prosperity. For most countries, India is an example, and they made a noise about this at the COP26 summit, of course. Dealing with poverty alleviation and providing economic growth and opportunity is their prime directive for the government. Climate is important, and they'll work on it, but not at the exclusion of, or not to the, if it's going to keep their people poor, basically, to put it bluntly. And that led to choices they made about burning coal, which is a domestically available, extremely cheap, government-sponsored and supported enterprise that millions of people work in the coal industry in India and depend on it. And they said, we're not going to phase out coal as everyone else wanted. We're going to phase it down. And you say, well, what does that small change mean? It means a lot to the atmosphere, right? Coal is the number one contributor of greenhouse gases and is a real problem, and especially coal in Asia, right? China most notoriously, but other Asian countries burning domestic, cheap, existing coal rather than substituting with the renewables or other alternatives is right at the, if we don't solve that problem, almost nothing else we do will matter in terms of curbing the extreme aspects of climate change, preventing the outcomes like 3 degrees or even higher overshoot, which would lead to terrible consequences. So that tension has to be resolved. And you propose one way to do it, that is, we use less in the developed world, in the rich world. That's a hard sell, as you know, in America. Telling Americans, like Greta does, that economic growth is the problem. We shouldn't have economic growth, or we should have less of it, or we should have negative growth, which is a camp of thinkers. And that means that people who are graduating from your university, it's possible you may have to take a smaller salary, or guess what? There'll be a number of jobs that are no longer available for you. That's going to be a hard sell on your campus, I would bet to you, especially for people that don't listen to this wonderful podcast. They may not care as much or be as aware about these issues. They'll say, wait a minute, I'm all okay for, using biodegradable spoons and sporks, but hey, don't take away my job. And so this gets into a real trade-off in practical terms that we need to have a conversation as a society. Is that how we are going to support this radical approach to taking on climate change? What may be a different path is to say, what was actually agreed under the UN process, that is, we'll have common goals but differentiated responsibilities. That's the UN speak for how developed countries, rich countries, are supposed to have much more ambitious targets. But that doesn't mean developing countries do nothing. And so we have different tasks. And Europe has led the way by making much deeper cuts in emissions, by subsidizing green energies much more aggressively and providing opportunity for new technologies to flourish. And by and large, they've done it in a way that's consistent with their economies prospering. No one thinks people in France are living in poverty. Now the French get very upset if you raise gasoline taxes a couple of cents, right? They protested and led to a massive backlash against President Macron. And so they're also not some sort of utopian environmentalists either. And so the politics of this, we have to get it right, because if the proposition given to people in a country is, you need to be poorer so that those other people over there can catch up with us and we can save the planet, most people are going to say, no, thank you. And so there has to be a different story that comes together. And part of that story might very well be, we need to invest much more in climate-friendly innovations. We need to do the things at the systemic level that we talked about, like the university administration upgrading its heating systems, or our country transforming its energy grid, and so on. So that there are things that we can do that are much more ambitious, that are opportunity and growth oriented, I think is much more likely to sell in America. I'm not defending this way of thinking. I'm just saying in practical terms, where we just had the most ambitious climate package in our country's history, basically skewered by one senator from a coal state, it's very hard to tell people, you need to be poor and your children will have less than you. They're just going to walk away from it.
This is where he and I, the way that this podcast formed is because he and I have very different perspectives of this question. Where I've always been kind of the person that you're speaking to, exactly where I want everyone to give up half of what they own and go live off the earth. And I don't know if this is because I went to a Waldorf school where I grew up tending sheep and donkeys as a child. I just became really connected with nature on a certain level, or because of my experience going to Morocco as a very young person and just seeing a real, kind of soaking that in to myself, whereas he is more driven by like the technology changes that can be made and innovation. And it's really interesting because I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because for myself, I grew up in New York City. So I grew up in like the carbon capital of the world in a way, just because of the density of concrete, of pollution, of everything. But then I also don't drive a car. So I always say like that's one technological innovation is public transport, right? Like better public transport, better communal infrastructure that everybody can use and share and reduces an individual carbon footprint is something that is a technological innovation. But then when you see the other side of it, like for example, green cars, like electric vehicles, when you have all these other green innovations like solar and wind and new technologies like carbon capture, there's no doubt that because of human ingenuity and innovation that we'll get to a point where we can suck carbon out of the atmosphere, where we can get to a point where something that is theoretically possible, physically possible, or predicted to be possible will become a reality. My problem is exactly what you said previously, which comes to how you invest in it. The infrastructure bill is a monetary bill, it's fiscal policy, and it's just where you're going to put money. So the $555 billion, which is kind of in limbo at the moment, that would be going towards innovation, new developments and technology, but then also, like has been discussed on your podcast to a lesser degree, the financing of that through the private sector as well. Like you put a price on carbon, when you invest in certain types of innovation, where you put money in certain places, there's a price to that. And there's been the theoretical ability to add a price to individual action, where your own individual footprint can have a carbon bill to it, and you can trade credits, just like a company can trade credits. But one thing I found really interesting when I was watching actually one of your videos on YouTube through The Economist about the carbon credit system is how it might work in theory and it might sound really smart to give everyone a certain amount of like tokens that they can use, and then they can exchange them and create a market for a secondary good, a secondary asset besides currency, which is this new thing, this new currency in a way, which relates to our carbon impact and our environmental impact, but it's the enforcement. And it's the same thing with technology, where we get into this very zealotous place of like wanting to just believe in everything, like believe that electric cars will save us. But then at the same time, you see that if we don't upgrade the means of producing electricity, the means of storing electricity, the actual production of those electric cars can be different across the globe. We're going to start reducing the amount of silicon that we have in the environment because we have to produce so many batteries. But then we produce a new kind of battery, but then there's always some other material. There's other environmental impacts beyond just carbon. And we're kind of letting a lot of things go as well. And as someone who understands concrete better than the average person, you know that there's a reduction in the amount of sand that's viable for concrete. And we're going to have a crisis with sand in the future, and all these other things where environmentalism and sustainability goes beyond just the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere. But that's a very big part of it. And I think the interesting thing with technology and understanding through a technological solution is it's not so much believing that there's a specific thing that's going to change the world, like how an iPhone, is like changed our way of perceiving reality in a way. There's not going to be one thing that solves climate, but there's a way of thinking, and there's a way of solving problems and a way of going through solutions. And I think what technology does more than anything else is it kind of breaks through that conservatist nature of human beings where we just want things to stay the same. Because if you give someone something that actually makes their life better or adds value in a way that there hasn't been value before, then they want to progress with that. That's what makes people like want to move forward and like become a better society. Like the utopian vision of society is always new technology, like new things, new innovations, new ways of existing in the world. But when it comes to asking people to reduce their living standards, that's where I realize that people will never want to go down. They always want to go up. And you have to find a way to supply that in the best way. And that's where technology tends to serve our current time. I mean, what do you think about when it comes to the fiscal policy that's being moved forward and the transitioning on that? Like, how do you see the reality of new technology and fiscal policy and that balance between innovation and government and these global organizations forcing specific things on companies, on individuals, on sociological changes without pushing the boundary of where people lose their autonomy, where you start yelling communism or authoritarianism.
Well, there's an awful lot to unpack in that question. I want to tie it to, I think, one of our listeners' questions I saw scroll across our screen here, which was challenging me on the point they made about personal choices, suggesting that, hey, people can buy EVs now, for example, or lease them. That would obviously be representing a change in the energy transition, and that's true. But let's roll that back. It's not one of the greatest energy thinkers who's been a great mentor and inspiration to me is Amory Lovins, who founded the Rocky Mountain Institute. And he has argued over the last 3-4 decades in seminal pieces that, among other things, rather than building ever more megawatts of power, we should start with negawatts. That is, look at energy efficiency, using less, building more efficiently, and numerous concepts that have now become commonplace in energy and environmental thinking. And among the things he pointed out was prices are important. Economists love to talk about price signals. Economists and The Economist, we love things like carbon taxes or some form of carbon regulation because greenhouse gases are what economists call externalities, right? They're not priced into the marketplace. When you burn dirty energy, you don't pay extra for it as compared to burning clean energy or using clean energy. And that's a problem the market will never solve per se, because there's no price signal. There's no incentive for companies to change their behavior. And so the most elegant way would be some form of global carbon pricing that's harmonized. We're not going to get there anytime soon, but this is the concept, right? But his rebuttal to that is very revealing. He says price signals are good, but much more important is the ability of people to respond to those price signals, right? And oftentimes, as let's say someone who rents an apartment in New York, you may end up with really lousy building stock that has terrible single pane windows, that's drafty, that has an old-fashioned boiler, etc., because the person who designed it, the architect, had a different incentive than the person who bought it. The person who leases it or the university that runs it is different from ultimately the person who signs a lease or is a sublet. So even if you're very green-minded and you want to upgrade the windows, you don't have the right to do that, right? And you may be ending up paying a much higher energy bills than you want to, but you cannot upgrade the boiler or ask the utility to put in insulation and so on, generally. Now, this is changing a bit, but this alignment of incentives problem, you don't have the ability to respond to price signals that Con Ed may give you because you're powerless in that situation. And like that, there's numerous examples of how and why there are incentive problems and simple policy fixes or even fiscal fixes can't fix that. But to the point about the person who asked, hey, what if a lot of us lease EVs or buy EVs, wouldn't that make a big difference? Isn't that personal choice? When the first real push to make electric cars was Thomas Edison, more than 100 years ago. One of his last projects in life was to try to get electric cars off the road. And he and Henry Ford even worked together to try to get EVs. In 1900, there were 10 times as many electric cars on the roads of Manhattan as there were gasoline-powered cars. In fact, the internal combustion engine cars in a famous race did so poorly that people on the sidelines shouted, "Get a horse! Get a horse!" And yet, obviously, the internal combustion engine, which uses gasoline, and the rise of big oil, thanks to Rockefeller's cartel and so on, ultimately, market factors and the energy density of gasoline ultimately led to one technology combination winning. It wasn't electric cars. We saw California try to force electric cars by mandate, something called the zero emissions vehicle mandate, before the technology was ready. And companies like GM brought out a little electric car that was very popular among celebrities, a handful. But then they said, this is, first of all, it was not a good experience. They didn't have much range, and they said, this is giving us a bad name. And also, they didn't want to encourage it, because basically they sell something else. They sell gasoline cars. So they took them all back from their leases and they crushed them. And the more sophisticated of your listeners would know, there's a wonderful movie called Who Killed the Electric Car that chronicled this terrible, sort of episode in American corporate history, which was frankly, because the market wasn't ready. People didn't want crappy cars that didn't go very far, that required a lot of time to charge, and that were a little bit ugly. Then, of course, we saw Elon Musk come around with his technologies of Tesla, ultimately prevailed in the marketplace. But how did that happen? it wasn't magic, and it wasn't because he's a genius alone, although he's a pretty clever guy. Government played a huge role, right? When he wanted to buy a car factory, loans from the Department of Energy, U.S. government subsidized his purchase of an old Toyota GM factory in California for a song. They got it for almost nothing. Multiple times the company was on the brink of bankruptcy, and if it wasn't for credits, federal tax credits, Californian tax credits for people to purchase electric vehicles, there would have been no marketplace. And the ability to sell those credits to other companies that couldn't make clean enough cars, right? There was a market in those credits as well. And like that, I can go on. If it wasn't for the reduction in price of batteries and related technologies and the achieving of scale by BYD, the Chinese mega battery and EV company, the Chinese taxpayers subsidizing the development of those things through cheap credit and government policies in China to give them some credit. They did want to develop these industries, and they directed capital in that authoritarian way you talked about previously, Devon. And in this case, it worked with battery technologies as it did with solar panels. And so there are multiple factors that were required. A lot of them involved policy interventions or dumb luck, let's say, but nevertheless, lots of things that failed, but some things that worked in order to make it possible for us to buy really cool Teslas now or lease them at a vaguely reasonable price. They're still very expensive, but it's at least it's competitive with some of the better cars made with the internal combustion engines. And so that's what I would say to the listener, that we have choice because the system changed, not organically without intervention from policy and subsidies and some enlightened planning by those who are interested in environmental policy making. I don't think electric cars would be viable today.
Yeah, it's so. I think that thing that you just said about the system changing is something that's really interesting to me personally, where we currently exist within this system that promotes a certain, especially in the actually because of Westernization and the United States kind of promoting its way of living throughout every corner of the globe. It's not just within the United States anymore, but there's this idea of the American dream and of success being having a big house, having 2 cars, being able to go on 2 vacations a year to Disneyland, or there's just this idea that kind of acts as a cultural hum that we live in within that system that you're talking about. Like, so even when we're trying to make change, we're still kind of, because I almost see it as like this jello that we're in, like we're trying to change, but we're still promoting a way of being that doesn't necessarily make us happy and doesn't necessarily make us healthy. And I'm curious to see what either of you think about, like, do you think that we need a completely different, a paradigm shift, like a complete paradigm shift in the way that we view ourselves as human beings, as the way we view success, in order to actually make changes? Because or are we just going to kind of revamp everything within this current system? Like, everyone will still have 2 cars, but there'll be 2 electric vehicles, and everyone will still want a big house, but it will be a big house with really energy efficient windows and water capture or something. Like, is that enough? I'm still trying to grapple with what I'm pushing for as a young, like, am I trying to champion people to go on this big paradigm shift and realize that 2 cars really might not make you the happiest person in the world, and that doesn't really fulfill you? Or say, all right, you think that will fulfill you, let's keep doing it, but instead make sure you get to electric.
Yeah, and there's the other thing on top of that, which is it better to have 2 cars? I mean, I know necessarily you need cars to get to work because our infrastructure is literally developed for the car, where it's illegal to put, for example, pedestrian walkways on some areas or some highways, for example, and we don't have great public infrastructure. So our society is built around this thing. But even when you look at the amount of energy it takes to drive to work in an electric car, it's still very costly for the environment if we aren't producing everything through renewable means. So there's decision making, and then there's also the societal infrastructure that we exist in, and it's kind of that double-edged sword, which is, should we just like swap everything out for an electric version and just assume that government's going to fund like renewables to a degree where we can just live 100% off of that? Or can we find some middle ground where maybe we just need 1 EV and we could share it, or find more communal ways of getting around, or shift from not going into the office to work and just going over Zoom to reduce your carbon footprint? Or do these have to be like implicit things that are subconsciously marketed to us? And that's the only way that we'll believe it's real, by shifting the American dream, right? And not selling that to the rest of the world as well, so they don't all come up to the amount of consumption that we have.
Yeah, because just quickly, like, I keep bringing up my family in Morocco. I'm sure you've seen this in India as well. Like, of course not everyone, because there's still mass inequality in Morocco, but my family members who were living very modestly when I was 5 to 10 are now kind of watching American TV shows and movies, and my cousins are wanting 2 cars. They're driving BMWs and living in big villas in Casablanca, the economic hub of Morocco, and working in finance. And like, we've totally sold this idea to them, and they still want to come to the United States, but they're kind of their McDonald's in Casablanca has a line out the door. It's like the place to go. It's so interesting. And I just to kind of back that up, like, we're totally selling this American dream, and we're not shifting what we're selling. So how can we even expect, okay, yeah, maybe we can expect countries to do everything with renewable energy, but we're not really asking anyone to, we're not asking ourselves, and we're not really promoting an idea of making changes in our lifestyles that actually promote a better future.
A better relationship with the environment.
Yeah.
It's a tough challenge. I think if there's 2 questions that I heard in that. One is sort of selling the American way of life, as it were, to the rest of the world, and the other is how much do we need to change ourselves? How radically do we need to change our lifestyles versus incremental changes, or allowing sort of innovation to come to the rescue? On the first point, I would say I would be a little bit careful about the idea of us bamboozling the world into living our decadent lifestyles. Remember, if we're selling something, people are buying, right? And so people can make their own choices also. They don't have to follow the American dream anymore. There is a very rich, successful part of the world, frankly, that is richer in many ways and more successful, at least when it comes to cultural, moral, and maybe environmental areas, and that's Europe. That's close to many parts of the world and has some connections more than we do. We've turned our back on the world in the last 10, 15 years. And there is a very powerful rising force offering an alternative vision, which is China, where parts of the world have some affinity for that, especially authoritarian governments, it must be admitted, but also places that remember American extractive companies and their relationships in Africa or Latin America. They don't actually have a fond memory of that. And so they may welcome another power with another way of life, another way of organizing stuff. Where they tend to have more top-down approaches and different choices. So I think people are buying what they look around, and they buy what they want to buy. I would give more credence to that. They may still make choices that you think are terrible for the climate, right? So that's a separate question, but they have their own autonomy, I would say. Where we can control our own actions in terms of promoting a certain lifestyle is, for example, the government subsidizing fossil fuel plants or energy companies over activities overseas. And here we've actually seen the Biden administration do some of this, as well as put pressure on the international institutions like the World Bank, which we control, to either cut back or entirely, in the case of funding coal plants overseas, through export credits and financing. There's a lot of ways in which the system works to prop up for multinational companies that want to do business in the developing world. And so there is a concerted push to stop that kind of resource colonialism, as it were, or a model of doing things, and to channel those resources into clean energy projects, for example. So that's a good thing if we can encourage, as well as sharing technical know-how from the National Renewable Energy Labs. And we have enormous amount of technical capacity on how to run a grid more effectively. California, for example, has had pretty green policies for 20 years in managing ever higher shares of renewables and other intermittent sources of power. They have the world's largest grid scale batteries. If all the power from solar turns off at 5 o'clock, let's say, because of it's cloudy or they don't have enough, they're able to get power from the largest lithium-ion banks in the world for about 4 hours of power, which is a lot for lithium-ion batteries at the grid scale, the most in the world. What we need is multi-day, even multi-season storage if we're going to get the renewable dream to come to life in the next 10 to 20 years, but at least they have so much going on. So I would say there are things we can share that are on the positive side, and we can withhold some of the negative things, but ultimately the choice is theirs to make.
Hi, Dale.
Hi, everybody. Vijay, nice to meet you. I'm Dale Willman, and I work journalist working at the Earth Institute with Andy Revkin and the Sustain What platform that Devon and Sofia are so incredibly ably using for this conversation, which has been amazing. And I know that they're getting toward the end here, and I wanted to jump in as sort of a host prerogative from lurking in the background, because there's a broader issue that you haven't addressed, I think helps to bring all this together. I think it was a little disingenuous when you said that people make their own choices, and that's an assumption where we're in a world of free will that's not subverted by Madison Avenue, and something that consistently and constantly tells us that we must do more, we must buy more, or we're incomplete as people. But I want to take this a little more broadly, and that is, I remember talking to an attorney years ago who said that when they go into the courtroom, their primary focus is not to win. Their primary focus is to set the rules for the playing field. So framing the issue, and if they frame it appropriately, then they're most likely going to win. And I say that in the context of capitalism. And you work for an organization that celebrates and honors the role of capitalism in business. But do we not need a shift? Do we not need a drastic shift? What Sofia was talking about before, a paradigm shift in how the world is framed through capitalism, at least our part of it. As you mentioned earlier, so much of the environment is an externality. It's not even factored in to the way capitalism rules. So putting minor adjustments, carbon credits, other things on top of that is, in a sense, a Band-Aid. When you have a system that is designed through Madison Avenue and other functions and the way externalities are created or included in that process, that is just not winnable in the sense of the environment. That capitalism, the way it functions, without drastic shifts to it. I'm not saying a shift to communism or anything else, but drastically changing the way capitalism in America functions, that we're never going to get to the point that we need to be.
So first of all, thank you, Dale. Nice to meet you. Though we hardly have, I think, a moment to have this exchange. Thanks also for the suggestion that I'm being disingenuous. It's always good to come on a show and be insulted.
Sorry,
in fact,
I didn't mean it quite as severe as harsh as it sounded.
People who have listened for the entire hour would know that most of my time was actually spent explaining why individuals are not empowered. In fact,
of course,
multiple examples I gave suggested that choices are being made for us, or we're put in a position where we don't have the freedom that we would like. My point about telling countries like India, where I was born and where I stay close to the politics of things, this is how you should make choices, is a new form of colonialism, and it will not be taken well. And we saw this at COP. When the American dream is peddled, people who live in India pick and choose elements of it that suit them, is my point. And countries are sovereign. They'll tend to make their own choices. And as I pointed out, subsidizing the worst of American capitalism is something that's terrible, and I'm glad that we're beginning to stop that, for example, with fossil fuel industries. But people watch Hollywood movies and say, gosh, that mansion looks great, I'd love that. I think it's going to be very hard to stop what people yearn for. They may also yearn for a small bungalow up in the hills like their grandfather used to have in the olden days and live close to the earth. I don't think that's something that Madison Avenue can make a decision for other countries. People make their own choices in their own countries. That's the point I was making. We should make our own choices in America and take on Madison Avenue with the way we choose, the way we live. And expressed through things like the UN process, global aspirations. I think that's really where the right venue is to try to encourage the world to make its own choices, different countries to make their own choices. And that's why the COP process is based on national plans. There's no global COP, there may be environmentalists who wish there were a global super COP or a benevolent dictator. But my experience, having lived in China a number of years, is the problem with benevolent dictators, even ones that want to save global warming in a good way, the benevolence goes away after a while, but the dictatorship stays. And so I'm really with Devon on his idea about democratic politics and empowering people when however messy it is, the choices tend to be better and more robust over time. And so even in America with Madison Avenue, with our excessive capitalist culture, I think we have a better chance to contribute to the solutions in climate change over time than we do now, than we have any time in the last 30 years. I think the awareness, as well as the interest from Washington, as well as interest from capital markets. Yes, capitalism, I think, can be part of the solution when we see the powerful wave of innovation that we're unleashing, both in policy, but also in technology. When it comes together with the kind of individual action that Sofia is talking about, I think that's when we're going to get the climate revolution. We need all of those pieces. And I don't think a filter or one thread of that, whether it's capitalism or whether it's top-down solutions from government, can work by itself.
And I opened that question with framing and gave a very poor example of framing, and my apologies for that. And that wasn't my intention. But I'm interested why the conversation doesn't come more toward these elements. Not your conversation, but the world conversation more about these elements of it. In Indonesia, the fastest growing area for cigarette consumption is with children. And it's because of the marketing that's done. It's because of the way that it's shown to be, as it was here many, many years ago, as being the cool thing to do. Advertising creates not wants but needs. Suddenly we need these things. And this is a part of a world that was defined by the US many, many years ago that has been exported. So you're right, there is this ability and this willingness in many countries to pick and choose those things. But I guess I'm trying to separate the need for growth for clean water, clean air, good housing, a salary, income enough to function and survive in a fashion with dignity. Separate that from these artificial wants and needs that still exist, and it's hard to get that separated. So how do we have that conversation about how to remove that element of consumption while not pairing that to the need for this, for the more basic needs that people need and deserve, if that makes sense.
What do you think, Devon? Sofia?
Well, I would say, and I know we're at the end here, so there might not be much time to comment, but generally I would say that where America kind of was a superpower after World War II, and we kind of dictated the way that most of the world went, and the decision making that we had through influence, through financial influence, through social influence, through invading other countries. America was very powerful in that sense. So I would say that there was this 20th century idea that the influence of the US was all an absolute. Where now, as like more countries, especially developing countries that have come up rapidly, like China, India, Morocco, and other parts of the world, are becoming more sovereign. And their decision making is becoming more insular. They're not being able to, or they don't need to bend the knee. Like India said, we don't want to diminish all coal or remove all coal, but we want to reduce it. We want to reduce our usage, not throw it out the window. And they had the control and the power to stand up and say that and actually have the decision go in their way. I think you see that there are systems in place because of capitalism, because of the environment that we live in, because everybody wants things. They want to have more. They don't just want to have sustenance. They want to enjoy life, and they think that they enjoy life through things. Like there's this balance between it.
Yeah, just to round everything off, I think the way that I see things, and I definitely don't think that the United States, I think that the rulers of Morocco and India are their own people and are extremely intelligent in making choices for their countries. But I do think that there's this thing that happened in the United States I think Dale is pointing towards, which is, I think a lot of this kind of cliche thing to say, but the GDP, the way that we measure, is so flawed. And I think I might think visually because I keep seeing things in my head when I say things, but I like GDP, we measure our country's success by GDP. Like, are we doing well? We have a high GDP, great, we're good. We're starting to look into other measurements now, but I think that there's still this really strong obsession with, oh, you have a lot of stuff, you're doing well. And then this correlation trickles down not only into the people of the United States, but into the people of every country. So we're just kind of, I think there is this real issue with the fact that we're perpetuating this idea that the more stuff you have, the better you are. And that's what I'm hearing Dale say, like this, and that's not only through just kind of the economic world of measurement, but it's also advertisement, and it plays into everything. And I think that's for me, that's kind of the most terrifying thing, and the thing that we need to focus on the most. How do we shift what people think is success, how people feel, and because then we're going to have governments promote a much different kind of lifestyle to their people.
Yeah, and that connects to the broken window fallacy, right? Like if a hurricane comes, smashes your window, and then you have to have it replaced, that's good for GDP. That's good for economic and investment, because you're spending money in the economy, even though there might have been this drastic thing that destroyed a whole community. But I think that's where the narrative comes in, the storytelling, the contextualization, where even if our economic tools and our measurement systems don't work, or someone in the US doesn't understand exactly what's happening in India or exactly what's happening in China, that's where you have to converse that through storytelling, you have to converse that through coverage, you have to talk about it, you have to connect people. And that's why it's good that conversations happen, especially the conversations on your podcast and your magazine, Dale with NPR and Andy through Sustain What, us taking over every once in a while, or just talking within ourselves.
And hosting Generation M.A.D.
Yeah, and communication's important. And that's kind of what we hope that everyone kind of takes out of this, which is to talk about these issues. Why we started this is because we saw not enough people were from our generation talking about these issues. And when they were, it was like in these small groups, in these very cloistered environments. But we wanted to bring this to more people, open it up with individuals like yourself, Vijay, who are experts, who have spent their whole lives and careers covering this personally and being able to talk about it. So we want to thank you again for coming on, and thank Dale and Andy for letting us host this event.
No, it's been a great honor to be here. So thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, and more power to you. I love what you're doing.
And we're grateful to Generation M.A.D for having these conversations. This is the best conversation I've heard on these issues in a very, very long time. So thank you for this, and a reminder that other student groups, other people on the Columbia campus interested in a takeover of Sustain What, we'd appreciate you reaching out to us. And Devon and Sofia, thank you so much for organizing this and making this happen. And Vijay, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Cheers.